I'm Glen Ocsko, and I work as part of the public sector team at Scott Logic. Scott Logic and I have been working in or with the public sector for nearly 20 years. And over that time, we've seen many digital directions come and go. However, today, I'd like to invite you to join me on a very hypothetical journey into a nightmare future. The year is 2025, and Cliff Richard is king. He's been king for as long as anyone can remember, and he's reigned pretty much unchallenged for decades. It's clear that unless something's done pretty soon, Cliff Richard is going to be here long after everybody who's dialed into this call and probably watching it on recordings in the future. Well, since we're all, he'll be around longer than any of us put together. But how did we get here? Because it wasn't always like that. No, Cliff wasn't around at the very beginning of music, despite appearances to the contrary. No, in the olden days, things were very different. All music was shared on paper, and everyone had to do things themselves in person. There was none of this sharing things remotely. It was all done in person, face to face. I mean, that didn't mean things couldn't move very fast if someone had a great idea. But to get from one side of the country to the other would have been painful and required someone walking between pubs and hoping they'll let them play their music. But then things changed a little bit. We had something of an evolution. Around the time of Glenn Miller, we had the big band sound really come into being, and radio started sharing sounds across the airwaves. We had new artists coming together. We had combinations that had never been achieved before. And the world of electricity really took hold. All of a sudden, you could print things off. You could print records. You could share your music left, right, and center and broadcast it so people who weren't face to face could actually get involved. Admittedly, it was still broadcast. So it was still one way, but it was a start. And into that world was born the great Cliff Richard. Cliff is our version of Elvis. He was fresh-faced, he was young, he was exciting, and actually, in his time, he was quite innovative. He was one of the people who brought rock and roll to the masses, as strange as that might sound today. And at the time, he was near universally loved, a clean-cut British hero. Of course, there were those other overseas options. They might have been showier and glitzier and more glamorous, but we had our Cliff, and he did a job. After a while, he did it some more. And then he did it some more. And he did it some more. Decade after decade after decade, he pretty much did the same thing, playing the same music to the same audience. He was unapologetic about the whole thing too. And despite this constant, never-ending release of the same sort of stuff, people somehow still bought it. Of course, people realised they weren't actually really that many alternatives on the market. Cliff's contemporaries, or the people around him, had pretty much been innovative in their own way back in the day. But they looked at Cliff's success and realised as his stranglehold on fans grew that actually they could just do the same. They didn't need to keep evolving themselves and wasting all of that energy, when instead they could just turn out the same sort of stuff for years and years and years, and people would still pay good money for it. By then, in our hypothetical world, they were all basically doing something pretty similar to each other, sometimes coming across as a bit edgy here and there, but realistically not changing all that much. And to retain their grip on the charts, they made their music available, each on their own limited formats. So fans of one artist would have to buy all new equipment to listen to the others. I mean, Who wants to go to the hassle of rebuilding your entire music collection from scratch just to listen to something which is basically the same? Not pretty much no one. No, it was actually much easier to just choose which one you're going to go with and stay with them for life, hoping that at some point they might release something new. In our fictional world, that's the way it was for a very, very long time. Every now and then, you might have someone come along who said, we're going to be different. I'm going to crash the scene. We'll make big waves, promise something new, something fresh, something clean, something different. Until you realize underneath it all, they're basically the same. Let's be honest, Michael Bublé is nothing more than a reskinned Harry Seacombe. All he's doing is churning out a slightly more polished, better version of stuff that's been around for a long, long time and somehow trying to pass it off as better when actually it's just a bit cleaner. Time had stood still for the majority of that music industry, but not all of it. There were people individually springing up left, right, and centre, artists who would actually excel in their own fields. But in our world, fictional world, they never got the chance to. They never got the chance to become as big as Sutcliffe. In fact, not only were they restricted to just their own genre of music, sometimes, if they actually got any traction, they'd be bought up and combined with Sutcliffe and his great franchise, as if it looked like it was worth doing so. And in doing so, they essentially just became a support act to the Cliff-shaped juggernaut, and they never operated in the same way as before they ever again. Now, in this fantasy world, the government saw this and decided enough's enough, and it's time for them to step in. They made a big public statement saying, we're going to do something different. We're going to actually stop him. We're going to release music of our own by putting together a special team to give people a real alternative option that will work. And the trouble is, no one's listening to them. Not enough people were getting on board with the new way of doing things to make it all stick. So realistically, most people ended up stuck with Cliff and his friends, and there's pretty much nothing anyone could do about it. What was there? Now, that all sounds a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? It's a silly analogy that describes an unbelievable situation. The idea that just a small number of old, outdated individuals dominating the music world for decades, well, it's pretty far-fetched. But if you replace some of the names of the singers with certain major players in the public sector software space, suddenly it all becomes a little less silly and a bit more serious. Let me take you through it. So, going back to our olden days, in those olden days, we saw paper records. We saw filing cabinets. Like the analogy, everything in the public sector was handwritten. And rarely was it easy or quick to access that. And certainly not easy to make it all portable and shareable. Then, when the early days of digital technology came along, it really got imaginations going. All of a sudden, data did become portable and shareable. Different systems could start talking to each other, and you could start seeing teams coming together to create new things. Trouble is, once a few of the more traditional big players came in, everybody interesting and everything they were doing kind of ground to a halt. Those big players essentially realized they could get away with minimum viable innovation. People would just keep using them because there was no real alternative competition to threaten them with. I mean, I won't name who those companies are or were, but we all know which large players actually dominate pretty much the entire market, from housing to social care, revs and bends to planning, and so much more. In most spaces, there's usually no more than 2 or 3 main providers who probably service around 80% or more of the market between them. In fact, in some areas, They carve up pretty much the entire thing between just one or two. Sometimes that new player will come into those markets and burst onto the scene, but often all they do is recreate what's already in place. One big system, stick a new label on it, maybe give it a nice up-to-date user interface, and that's about it. Then they soon devolve down to the mean and become just another provider. They revert to doing just the bare minimum, delivering that minimum viable level of innovation, releasing a little bit here and there, just hoping it creates enough of a scene to get a bit more market share. Eventually, either they fold or they're folded into one of the other big players. And I'll be honest and frank, it's just not good enough. So how have we let this happen in our real digital world? Harvard's Business School has got a professor called Michael Porter. He's described 5 forces which themselves describe the competitive nature of any industry and how companies approach these industries to become and remain profitable. Now, when we apply it to the public sector digital space, it really makes for sobering thought. You see, the big players, well, they're just not scared of new entrants into the market. Actually trying to create something and get it out there in terms of a major platform that's going to rival what they're doing, well, it has been tried by some, but it's so hard because there's so many areas of that public sector that need to be serviced. So these monolithic providers can just get away with people thinking, you know what, it's probably too difficult, so let's just stay as we are. They haven't really got much rivalry between them either. Yes, there's going to be situations where a contract finishes and one of the other big players picks it up from them, or vice versa. I'm sure they've each got growth ambitions to rule the world in the way that a few providers in very niche sectors do, but realistically, they've carved their own markets up long ago, and it's kind of marginal gains at this point. The way they're growing at the moment isn't by creating any proper rivalry between them to drive innovation. It's just by picking off those smaller players and buying up new logos through acquisition. There aren't really that many substitutes out there because it is hard to get into. As soon as you look like you're doing well, a big player simply snaps you up. As a result, there just aren't these substitutes, these alternatives for people to go to. And because of that, you, as buyers, have very little power. You don't really have the ability to say, well, if you don't give us something better, we're going elsewhere. You don't actually have the ability to hold many of these suppliers over a barrel. In fact, it's usually the other way around. And not only is it really difficult to find someone else to go to, even if you do manage to find some alternative supplier that's out there, there are probably going to be huge contractual issues to deal with in the process, including massive fees just for exiting a contract. One organization I worked with was informed it would cost them nearly twice the value of the contract itself just to go through the process of leaving it. They were forced to conclude that they may as well just renew, as they simply couldn't afford to leave. Now, of course, moving suppliers does create risk. Personally, having spent a decade working inside the public sector and nearly the same again working alongside it, I'm well aware of the risk aversion that's embedded throughout the sector for very good reason. But this risk aversion does make life very difficult when it comes to the need to evolve and grow and change. So it's no wonder these monoliths exist. These singular organizations, or just a couple who claim to do everything a service needs, they want to put everything together and keep hold of it as well. And that, for me, is one of the most frustrating elements of public sector digital services. You see, these organizations hoard data as if their lives depended on it because, let's face it, they do. But the data they hoard, it's yours. The data belongs to the people who submitted it for use by you. It doesn't belong to these companies, no matter how much their contracts might claim otherwise. In fact, most of them just try and get you to put ever more amounts of data into their proprietary locked away platforms, saying, this is great, it's amazing. Give us all of your data, put everything in. In fact, take out that platform over there entirely and just put everything into ours. Keep it locked away with us, and we might be able to do some cool stuff with it. Well, that's all well and good in theory. But the trouble is, you're then tied into their platform, their way of doing it, and you can't easily unlock yourself from that. Rarely do they let others interplay nicely with their systems and the data they hold. I mean, even if the APIs they put into place work, rarely are they actually as open as they claim to be. I recall working with one organization to support them as they wanted to unlock some data which had been held in some proprietary platforms historically they'd been using. The provider of that platform did get wind of this. We worked with that client to design a way for them to open that data flow so we could actually put their data into a central store owned by them, along with loads of other data that had been already taken from other platforms. But literally the day before our work went live, that provider just switched the APIs off, just turned them off overnight, saying, nope, sorry, we can't do it. And thanks to the original contract signed years earlier, there wasn't a single thing that could be done about it. That is unacceptable. That situation prevents you from doing incredible things with data. I mean, obviously, any work with data has to be done with information governance in mind, and it has to be done securely and safely and within the law in terms of spirit and limit of it. But when you do combine data sets, you can do incredible things. But if all your data is locked away in separate platforms, how are you supposed to make the most of it? How are you supposed to use it to do good? And if you're not using data to drive service improvements, what's the point of having it? And that's the trouble with these monolithic platforms represented here by Cliff Richard. Even when you're talking about moving away from one, they just rely on the fact that all you're going to do is go to another. And it's pretty much, to be frank, much of a muchness. We need to do something fundamentally different. We need to shift away from this one system to rule them all mindset and start building an open set of products using shared common standards. That approach means we'll end up with potentially a large number of individual products, but where each is perfectly formed and operates perfectly to deliver the one thing they're designed to deliver. By taking this small slice mentality, we're not going to try and recreate a massive platform all at once. Trying to eat that whole elephant in one bite is crazy. No, we're taking it one bite at a time, replacing these monolithic suppliers one sprint at a time. Because if every one of those products works perfectly in and of its own right, well, I'm going to go back to our silly music analogy because that's just how my brain works. Each of them will operate at high standards, and however they've built themselves up, they'll all operate in the same sort of way. Imagine each product as an individual act. In music terms, whether they've played grotty clubs where you jump up and down and stick to the floor at the same time, or whether they've been found and shaped in a lab by Simon Cowell, well, each one of them has a strong story and have honed their craft. They'll all release in the same way through a standard set of platforms using standard sets of technology so that everyone can access them. We need to get to a stage where each one of these products, even if they're built independently, even if they're built by entirely different suppliers, is releasing and are released in a similar, consistent manner across the board to consistent standards. Because when we start doing that, we can help start combining them in really interesting ways. You can still have that single tool which draws some of these tools together again. But importantly, in a way which enhances them rather than controls them. Something which takes fundamentally different things, but where each understands the other, which draws it all together and makes something even better. There are different central elements that could be used, but an easy way to begin could well be a low-code platform. This is something that companies like Mara are working on. The idea behind low-code is all about trying to make digital development easy and trying to show you don't have to operate in the same way as before. Low-code offers the ability to have some really easy to implement APIs and connectors, which will integrate with third-party tools that developers already use. So there's less time lost due to learning curves and picking things up. You can start building capacity and capability within your teams and services to allow you to just own this stuff yourself. And if you can't, there's a plethora of suppliers out there who can work with these technologies to provide you with the exact products you need, rather than just something that someone else has decided to sell you. And you can do all this with one click. So much of it is drag and droppable using really simple applications that can get things combined and spun up and released and tested very, very quickly. It takes away so many of the time-consuming processes of deployment and operations that have been common in the past. And it might just stop some of the shadow IT starting up, as it currently does, where essentially people need to get the job done. So they're going to find a tool to work with one way or another. A low-code platform will start moving you away from those big suppliers trying to do everything and break that down into a much more API-driven product mentality. But that's only part of the journey. Low-code tools are a big part of the answer, but not the whole answer. To stretch our overused analogy even further, we need to take more of a festival approach rather than a gig approach to our digital challenges. If you go to a gig and the headline act doesn't turn up, things are ruined. They're the star of the show, and if they're substandard, then it all falls apart. However, if you go to a festival, you know that everything there is part of a bigger whole. I mean, it doesn't matter really who headlines Glastonbury. The tickets are going to get sold in seconds, and everyone will find things there that work for them. And that's where we need to get to. A mindset of public service as a platform, where the exact makeup of it can change, but the whole system still works successfully, because at the end of the day, flexibility is key. After all, at one festival, they may know that the Stereophonics, Bastille and Sam Fender will work best for their audience. While at another organisation, they might take a look and agree, yeah, we do want a bit of Sam Fender, so we'll take that. But we also need some E17 and a sprinkling of Earth, Wind and Fire. That's where we need to get to. Position where you have alternative options for each of the systems and platforms and products out there, so you can put together the right mix for you and know that it all just works together. That way, you'll never be held over a barrel yourself by any supplier telling you that they're going to up the license fee again, even though they haven't released any new tech or used or patched it at all. At the moment, they just ask, what are you going to do about it? Well, in this case, you get them out and you get a new person in, because everything just fits together like Lego blocks. You'll also know by doing this, you're also contributing to the future. You're creating a system and a space where innovation is required, where each one of these providers has to keep innovating, has to keep growing, and has to keep evolving. Otherwise, they're replaceable. It doesn't preclude long-term relationships and great partnerships. I mean, that's what most providers want, is a real proper partnership. But it does mean that we don't end up with just a load of the same thing doing the barest minimum that's possible. Because if that does happen, someone new is going to come along and radically change things and have the ability to enter the market much more easily in a small, realistic scale than ever before. What it also does is allow you then to much more affordably look at how you can reinvest in those platforms and these tools and these products. When you start breaking it down into a more granular level, this reinvestment becomes possible. After all, you can't afford to replace universal housing. You can't afford to replace social care platforms by building them from scratch and spending millions upon millions on them. But you can afford to replace a part of it. Then a proportion of the money you save from that will be able to be reinvested in the next step. I mean, it's a simple feedback loop. It allows you to launch a service, understand how it's going to generate savings, both in terms of efficiencies, but also in terms of license cost, and then realize those savings. Do what you need to do with them, but commit to reinvesting some of them in the next phase of development, whether that's evolving what you've already put out there, or whether it's actually working out what the next bit is that you can work on. This cumulative savings through products will grow into something massive. You'll seriously reduce your licensing costs, open up and democratize the marketplace that is available to you, and have a much more sustainable future because you'll be in control of it rather than just relying on what's already out there, relying on what somebody else tells you is good. Let's go back to Cliff, because to be frank, he can still be part of this. By all means, there is a place for Cliff Richard in the musical world, as my mum keeps telling me. I'm not saying we should get rid of him entirely. No, what I'm saying is he shouldn't be the only headline act out there. All the legacy providers that we work with across the public sector should be looking at this as a real opportunity. An opportunity to be pushed. An opportunity for them to demonstrate why they're better than any alternative. Because at the moment, they only need to be better than their contemporaries. And even then, that's an arguable thing. Too often, they're only used because there aren't alternatives. So this is a chance for them to show how they're going to massively improve how they operate, how they're going to improve how they work with data, how they share things across different platforms, how they use open standards, and how they do things the way they actually should be done. And if they don't, well, you know what? Get rid of them. You'll have viable alternatives. You won't be held over that barrel as we have been for so long in the past. Either way, it's a win-win. And when we do move to a more product-based mindset and an approach with interoperable product sets from a variety of suppliers, well, they won't become legacy. Because others will then step in and be able to say, we can't do everything, but we can do that one thing with extreme excellence, so we'll do that. And it's your job then just to make sure they all work well with others. That is how you build a community. And that's what we need, is a community of people, whether they're providing the tech or engaging with how it's produced and developed or implementing it, or actually whether they're policy people who don't know code, but do know what's needed to get out of those platforms and products and tools. All of those people and more will be people who can actually discuss the standards that should be used, which actually will allow those semi-organized collections of contributors and suppliers and bring their shared interests together to build something which can be shared with anyone, inside or outside of that community. These distributed communities will be spread across the entire country and will allow the best of every organization to contribute. It will, of course, still need to be done with care. It's important that organizations don't simply just dump their code out into the public and say, well, there you go, work on it. And if you don't innovate, that's on you. Nope. We need our tools to operate in a really collaborative way where the best of the private sector's ability to move at speed is matched with the best of the public sector's awareness of what needs to be done. I've whizzed through that all a bit, but there's just a few final things I want to emphasize as we come to the end. Data is at the heart of everything you do. It's what gives you the power to make decisions and to move from reactive to proactive service delivery. And the public sector has huge amounts of data, but it's too often locked away. We need to work with more open data standards and make sure through APIs and a variety of technologies and tools that data can flow more easily between products and between platforms. That's the only way we're going to decentralize it all and move to a position where the tools themselves can be switched in and out. Don't let any one organization hoard your data and keep it all to themselves. Secondly, create that feedback loop of investment. These aren't things you can just do once and then leave. They'll just wither on the vine. You need to make sure you see this as a commitment to a way of working and not just a quick fix. Low-code tech, it's a fantastic way to start that journey, to go from monolith to a variety of tools which are safe, secure, tested, and supported. I recommend having a look at some of the low-code platforms that are out there and seeing if there's a few services where you can test the water. I'd also be more than happy to get the Mara team to talk with you about using the sort of the Microsoft tools you already have in place and already probably pay for as part of that work. But however you do it, remember that these modular, shareable, reusable tools, they're the things that are going to force providers to up their game. Either they do, which is fantastic and it's a win for the sector, or they don't and we get rid of them. And that's a fine thing too, because whoever gets put in their place has to be better. And build communities. These aren't things that you just buy and get and put in place and then ignore. Be part of those communities. Contribute your teams, contribute your thoughts, contribute your ideas, because we need to keep the end users in mind at every stage. And that's something that far too few of the big legacy providers do. They'll do what's good for their shareholders, not what's good for the users. And most importantly, let's just remember that Cliff Richard, he should never rule the world. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.